fresh, pure, holy people. Peace in you, peace in me, peace for everybody. Fresh, pure, holy peace.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. This is the 8th segment in the series, Peace and Justice for All. In the previous segments, we started to touch a little bit on some of the basic and sensible rules of interpretations, especially of the text of the Quran. But there is something to be added before we get into specific examples from the Quran or specific verses that allegedly inciting violence or disrespect for the life of other people simply because they chose not to be Muslims. And this is not really a rule, it's perhaps maybe even it's a foundation for interpretation. The values that have been so much emphasized in the Quran, whose wording is quite definitive, that need to be considered in weighing or judging whether one interpretation is closer to the truth or the other, or even in some cases, maybe to come to the conclusion that a particular interpretation of the text of the Quran is totally erroneous. Let's take just a few of those values. There is no question for anyone who reads the Quran honestly that throughout it upholds the absolute oneness of the Creator. As such, it's not a fight between one God against the other. All human beings are the creatures and servants of the same universal God of all. That's a value. And it's very important because the absence of which sometimes, unfortunately, people get into the so-called war of gods. I'm fighting on behalf of my God against your God. My God is true and your God is false. There's the one true God is one, and He's one for all. All humanity are His servants. Secondly, along the same line, oneness of Allah implies also the oneness of prophethood and revelation. Oneness doesn't mean that all the revelations were identical in all their details, guidance or laws, but it means that as a pillar of Islam, a Muslim must believe in, respect and adore, and believe in a way, in all the prophets of Allah, because they are brothers of one another. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, used to refer to Musa or Isa alayhi salam, my brother. They're not conflicting with one another. Their messages are not contradictory. It is people coming after them that made it contradictory. But if we really get the authentic essence of the teaching of all of the prophets, it's emanating from the same God, and it has the same essential teaching, not in details, but essential core teaching. How does that relate to our interpretation in the Quran, especially in the issue of relationship between Muslims and people of other faith communities? I believe it's significant, because I'm not again fighting on behalf of my prophet against your prophet. My prophet is true, your prophet is false. No, all prophets mentioned in the Quran and not mentioned in the Quran that meet the criteria that they all preached the pure monotheistic faith revealed by Allah to all of the prophets according to the Quran. They're brethren. That also might give us an indication of accepting others, even if there is presumption that their faith has undergone some historical changes in doctrines or whatever. Still, the prophets are the same. So there is no enmity between Muslims because they believe in Prophet Muhammad against the Jews because they believe in Moses, because Muslims consider Moses their prophet as well. There should be no enmity between Muslims and Christians because some people say Christians follow Christ and Muslims follow Muhammad. No, Muslims follow Muhammad and Christ and Moses and Abraham and Noah, peace be upon them all. This is perhaps one of those values that are so obvious in the Quran, but sometimes it escapes people's mind when they jump to some conclusions in interpreting certain delicate verses in the Quran. Then there is another important value, especially when people say the Quran say go and kill the non-believers, that twisted interpretation. That the Quran makes it clear, and you tell me if this is decisive in your mind, or allegorical or iffy. When the Quran says in Surah 5 in Ayah 32, very clearly, after it speaks about how Allah revealed to the Israelite prophets the respect of sanctity of life, it reiterates what Allah taught to other prophets, that whoever takes a single life, meaning of a human, without any due course of law or due cause, like for example, punishing the murderer or something of that nature, he is like one who killed the entire humanity, the whole of humanity. And to save a single life, a human life, is like saving the whole of humanity. What could be more clear than that? And if you look carefully at the wording, there's no way to wiggle around it. You cannot say, oh, but that verse applies saving the life of a Muslim. No, because it did not specify that. It says an-nafs, general, a human soul, which apply to Muslims as well as others. And that's not the only verse in the Quran. The same thing also is found in other surahs in the Quran, like Surah or chapter 17, Al-Isra. We find the same thing also about the sanctity of human life. That is very essential, again, when we come to these verses that appear to say, you know, kill or fight. What are the circumstances? What does it mean, really? There is also the notion that will come in some of the controversial verses that say the Quran actually indicate that Islam was revealed to prevail over all religions, so there will be no other religion in the world but Islam. Right or wrong? Dead wrong. The Quran in Surah 2, verse 256 makes it very, very clear, La ikraha fi ddin. Ikrah means there should be no, not compulsion, because sometimes compulsion meaning using of force or threat of murder or whatever. Ikrah actually even lighter than that, meaning coercion. Let there be no coercion in the matters of faith. Truth has been made distinct from falsehood. There are numerous verses in the Quran that affirm that principle of freedom of belief and worship. There's no question about it. It's not one or two, there are many of them. And that does not only mean the freedom of Muslims to practice their faith, that's part of it. The freedom of others also to practice their faith. Amazingly, for example, in Surah Al-Hajj, in I think it's verses 39 and 40, and elsewhere, it makes it clear that the protection of places of worship of all people must be protected. Even though the verses make, of course, specific mention of the people of the book, but there is no evidence that it precludes others. It says, had it not been that Allah checks the aggression, meaning, quote unquote, of one people by means of others, i.e., you know, the countervailing powers, that if some people have absolute power, they can do lots of havoc and persecution. So the law of history is that Allah always have some other people checking the power of others or resisting the aggression of others. But anyway, it says, had it not been that Allah checks, meaning the power of one group of people by means of others, لهدمت صوامع وبيع وصلوات ومساجد يذكر فيها اسم الله كثيرا. That many places of worship, this is interpretive, would have been destroyed. And the Quran mentioned monasteries, synagogues, Jewish synagogues, churches, in where the name of, and then at the end even it says mosques, masajid. Another important value that generate tolerance if Muslims really understand it and implement it. Two conditions: proper understanding, proper implementation. And that is the idea of not only allowing and permitting freedom of expression or belief or worship, but also accepting the fact of life that in human societies there is plurality. Let me just give you one sample of that. In Surah 10, verse 99, It says, وَلَوْ شَاءَ رَبُّكَ لَآمَنَ مَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ كُلُّهُم جَمِيعًا أَفَأَنْتَ تُكْرِهُ النَّاسَ حَتَّى يَكُونُوا مُؤْمِنِينَ, addressing Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And it says, if your Lord, means Allah, if your Lord willed or wished, all people on earth could have been believers. Are you then going to force people to be believers? Of course, that's a rhetorical question. Are you then going to force people to be believers? Which means belief has to come from the person, not to be imposed upon him. We'll resume, inshallah, after the break with a couple of more values and then move on to specific verses under discussion. Assalamu alaikum.
You holy be, you holy be.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We resume, inshallah, with our discussion of the basic values in Islam, or some of them at least, central values, that should shape any interpretation of the verses of the Quran besides what has been mentioned previously. One of those values is the value of justice. That we have discussed before, but just by way of reminder, the Quran demands justice. Justice even if it goes against your own interest or the interest of your close kins. Even the nobility in the Quran points out that justice should be done even in dealing with the enemy. It said, don't let the hatred of others dissuade you from doing justice. And again, that should be a guide in interpreting verses that are allegedly against non-Muslims or calling for violence or depriving them of any of their legitimate rights. Finally, perhaps the most important one, forgive me for repeating again because we'll keep repeating it, because it is a verse in the Quran that is seldom quoted by those who make this allegation about the Quran and its so-called connection or incitement of violence. It's seldom quoted because it destroys all the things that they say. It appears in chapter 60, and it's verse 8, that Allah does not restrain you or prevent you, O Muslims, with respect to those who are not fighting you because of your religion or driving you out of your homes, that you should deal with them in kindness and justice, for Allah loves those who do good. In fact, in a previous section, we might have gone a little bit in more detail to show that it is not only justice, it's more than justice, not only kindness, it is more than kindness. But again, I don't want to repeat too much of this detail. This is simply a reminder of the basic rule in the Quran, which is peaceful, just coexistence with other people. That is the rule. And that this verse, if you recall from a previous segment, is totally and fully consistent with the second chapter in the Quran, verses from 190 to 194, that made it crystal clear that there are only two occasions or justifications that you may use your force to achieve peace and justice if it could not be achieved otherwise, and that is aggression against you, unprovoked aggression, or severe oppression. And the verses actually in chapter 2 refers or alludes to people who were driven from their homes, and we know historically they were the Muslims who were driven from their homes because of persecution. So remember that in the future we might refer to it, but without details, just that chapter 60 about the peaceful coexistence, or the verse about peaceful coexistence between Muslims and others. I hope with this review, that might sound a little dry for some of you because you're talking about what you might call hermeneutics or the rules of interpretation. Let us apply it specifically to some verses. Perhaps the most misquoted and most abused, most misinterpreted verse, largely by people of other faith communities or Islamophobes, you might say, but in some cases even by some misguided Muslims as well. It appears in chapter 9, and the verse number is 5. And surprising enough, in a lot of articles and literature I have seen about this verse, they call it the verse of killing non-believers, oftentimes it is not quoted in full. Even if it is quoted in full, the quotations ignore the verses before and after it that shed light on its true meaning. What do we call that, remember? Cut and paste. Selectively take something out of context and say, look, it speaks about violence. You know what is quoted normally? Oh, it says, but the Quran says, kill the non-believers. And I've seen in some article somebody attacking Islam, and he's adding between brackets his own interpretation also. Kill the non-believers, and then he says, including Jews and Christians. Notice this, including Jews and Christians. Kill them, wherever you find them, seize them, stay in ambush for them, and say, what is more clear than incitement of killing anyone who is a non-believer? Let's apply some of the previous rule to see whether this is a sound interpretation or a misguided one at best and deliberately distorted at worst. First of all, many people who write in English, for example, in the West to make that claim, they realize that a lot of people do not have easy access to the Quran, even though it's available, even the internet, but many people would not bother to go and check on what they're writing. So people don't know whether this is the full verse or not. They don't know whether there is context to that or not. They don't know even whether the translation in English is accurate or not. Let me take first one aspect which may appear to be deliberate distortion. When they say the Quran says, and start only from the part of the verse says, you know, kill the unbelievers, quote unquote, wherever you find them. You know, when you start from the beginning of the verse, what it says? It says, فَإِذَا انْسَلَخَ الْأَشْهُرُ الْحُرُمُ. When the sacred months had elapsed, then kill the unbelievers wherever you find. And again, I'm not translating unbeliever, I'm saying even with their wrong quotation. But you know why that is omitted? Because for any intelligent, truth-seeking non-Muslim, if you draw their attention, he might start asking, what is the context of that verse? Because what are the sacred months? And why this period, grace period of sacred months we're giving? Mere raising the question might lead the person to discover something contrary to what the attackers or the Islamophobes are trying to prove. The sacred months, just for your information, that Islam continued with a tradition that the Arabs had before, that there are 4 months in a year, 3 of them are consecutive and 1 is different, where it is forbidden to fight. And it is said that a person even would meet the murderer of his father during this sacred month, but this is a period of cessation of hostility. And by the way, this is rather interesting that Islam said that even if you have to go for necessity to war, if everybody respects these 4 months, that means 1/3 at least of the time there could be no hostilities. But the point, I'm not basically here to explain what the Ashhur al-Hurum or the sacred month, but just to indicate that when they omit the beginning of the verse, it does not arouse too much interest on a part of people, and they may discover that the interpretation given by the writer is really twisted and with an agenda, not an honest scholarly interpretation of the Quran. That's one. But let me take the question of unbelievers. The term that appears in the Quran is al-mushrikeen in Arabic, al-mushrikeen. For someone to put between brackets, including Jews and Christians, means that their knowledge of the Quran has a lot to be desired. In the Quran, there are various terms used to people who rejected Islam or did not wish to accept Islam. Perhaps the most common term is kuffar. Kuffar means rejected Islam, and I'll give you a check. I'll come back in detail in another context to analyze the term kafir and what does it mean. But in any case, فَاقْتُلُوا الْمُشْرِكِينَ is not really, it doesn't say kill the non-believers in Islam. The word kafir or kuffar mean those who rejected Islam or did not worship. But according to the Quran also, they have every right to be kuffar and to be treated also humanly, because believing or rejecting of faith is a free choice that Allah has given to all human beings. There is no force, as we mentioned before, or compulsion in faith. But then in the Quran, according to the 98th surah, in the first verse, لم يكن الذين كفروا من أهل الكتاب والمشركين. It divides two major groups among those who rejected faith in Islam, which is their right, into two different and distinct groups. One group is called Ahlul Kitab, which means the people of the book. And people of the book here refers to, according to most interpretation, Jews and Christians. Some might say other people might belong to the same category, if indeed they had originally a revealed book. But the most common, that at least people of the book means Jews and Christians. Is that a derogatory term? No, it isn't. It is a complementary term. The mere fact that it says people of the book, meaning that their faith, like Muslims, is based on what they believe to be a revealed book. Whether it's the Torah and other Hebrew scripture books, in the case of Jews, or the New Testament and other New Testament and the Gospels and the other literature. Irrespective of our assessment or acceptance of whether these scriptures are completely intact or not, aside from that. But the fact, the mere fact, that they base their faith on what they believe to be, and what the Quran referred to actually as originally revealed from the Creator, meaning that they are closer to Muslims. So it is actually a complementary term for that matter. And it's not only a matter of term, even in some legal aspects, like some limited form of interfaith marriage, the people of the book are distinct. Just to give you an example, a Muslim cannot eat the meat of animals that are killed, for example, by an atheist, or could have been dedicated to idols or something of that nature, but he or she is allowed to eat the meat from a person from the people of the book, Jews and Christians. There is some, like I said, also a limited form of intermarriage between Muslims and the people of the book. Now, this is one category that comes under the broader rubric or title of kuffar, or people who did not accept Islam. Now, how about the other category besides people of the book? Inshallah, we'll get into that as we continue in that series in the 9th segment, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Peace in you, peace in me, peace for everybody. Fresh, pure, holy peace. Oh, peace in you, peace in me, peace for everybody. Fresh, pure, holy peace. I feel the peace inside of me, a complete tranquility. I remember Allah